Hi there, and welcome to this episode of OctoPrint on Air, which is number 70. And as always, I'm your host, Gina Heuske. And first of all, long time no see. Really, really sorry for that. But the thing is that you might have noticed that a week or so ago, or rather 2 weeks ago, when I released this publicly, I pushed the first release candidate of the new version of OctoPrint. And it turned out that the push towards this was a very, very, very intense 2 months that had me reviewing a ton of pull requests for bug fixes and also cleaning up and such. And I'll talk more about this in a second, but I figured it was more important to get the next release of the software, or rather the first release candidate for the next release of the software in front of you than talking to you about what I'm doing. So in short, rather doing it than talking about it. So that was the reason why I postponed recording this until the first release candidate was actually out. And the first stress phase due to this release candidate being available was also down a bit. So here we are now. And as always, we are going to talk today about what I've been up to and also what the next steps will be. So without further ado, let's get started right away. What I've been up to. So you hopefully saw that I pushed out 2.0.0 RC1 on April 27th. And those of you who have following me here and also my communication about the whole next big release of OctoPrint might now be a bit confused and wondering what the heck happened to OctoPrint 1.12. 2.0 is 1.12, or rather 1.12 got renamed into 2.0. And the reason for that is that you might remember that I did some heavy refactoring in what is now called 2.0 in order to get the new printer connector interface set up and working, and everything surrounding that with regards to storage support and all of that, and also the API adjustments that I had to do. Both internal and external. And that was so much stuff and so heavily invasive stuff that I frankly worried that I had introduced some backwards incompatibilities that would be impossible to solve in a way that would then not basically nuke the whole work that I did on the refactoring. So I decided, okay, maybe now is just the time that we need to say this is going to be a big one, and it is a big one. It certainly is a really, really big one, internally mostly. As I cannot guarantee backwards compatibility as much as I made sure, or try to make sure that actually everything is still backwards compatible, I decided to simply say, okay, semantic versioning says if you're not backwards compatible anymore in your APIs, then you need to bump the major version. So go from 1 to 2 in this case. And so that is what I did here. And while I was at that, I realized this is the chance that the best chance that I've ever gotten in a decade to finally get rid of some deprecations that I've been carrying around in the code for partially over a decade now. Stuff that I have long replaced with better working things, that I have long replaced with better designed APIs and better calling parameter structures and all of that. And this is what I now also did. So I after the decision was made to call this release 2.0 instead of 1.12, I sat down and did a long overdue spring cleaning. I removed several compatibility layers for various long-term deprecations, so stuff that had been deprecated for years at this point, up to and over even a decade in some places. And that alone had me do something like delete 1,200 lines of code that now no longer need to be maintained constantly and worked around, and that is really nice. But it also has a downside, sadly. You see, OctoPrint's plugin system is a really, really cool thing, but it also always means a lot of headaches when it comes to cleaning up things, renaming things, and all of that. And it turns out that plenty of third-party plugin authors out there have been happily ignoring deprecation warnings in their logs for the past decade now and still rely on a lot of that stuff that I deprecated back in 2016. So if I sound a bit frustrated, that is simply because I really am. It was a bit frustrating to realize how many plugins are actually still relying on all of this old stuff that really no one should have been using anymore. And even plugins that are younger than the deprecations. So people happily implemented against deprecated APIs, probably because they copied from other older plugins or simply didn't read the logs or something. I don't know. But yeah, so that is now a bit of a problem with 2.0, that a number of plugins out there, and I think the biggest issue we saw are something like 60 or so on the official plugin repository, but some of them quite popular, break with 2.0. Rest assured, this is not how we will leave things. So the first thing that I did to compensate for that is, first of all, I sat down and wrote a migration guide. This is now available on docs.octoprint.org. If you check out the docs for 2.0, you'll have to switch to that in the little version selection thing in the lower left, I think. And that migration guide under developing plugins, that migration guide lists every single thing that has been removed, with examples how to replace it. And often that is simply something like something changed from, now I can't think of an example, but something changed from set foo to set underscore foo with a lowercase f instead of an uppercase f or something. So simple renames, but renames that need to be done now and that actually should have been done 10 years ago. So that migration guide exists, and the plan is to use the RC phase to try to support plugin maintainers as much as possible to migrate their plugins in the shape of pull requests or also helping out where things aren't as easy to work around or something like that. So basically my ears are open. I'll do my best to support the community here, but this step simply needed to be done. I cannot carry around cruddy, old, ancient code that is just causing an increasing amount of maintenance overhead simply because people don't read deprecation warnings. Deprecations are there to give people plenty of heads up to migrate to new replacement code, but that also requires that they actually do migrate and don't just ignore the deprecation warnings and sit there and then, stuff at some point starts breaking. So yeah, that was a bit of a sad realization that so many plugins actually are affected by this. But as I said, I'll do my best to help fixing this until the stable release of 2.0. And where the plugin author cannot be reached anymore, the plugin is effectively abandoned. The current idea is to do something like a soft adoption of such plugins, basically just forking them on the OctoPrint organization, doing the necessary work to get them working under 2.0 again. But other than that, not maintaining them any further, but actually putting up an abandonment notification for them on a plugin repository, so that hopefully someone else will be found that is open to maintaining them. That's the current idea, at least. But yeah, so long story short, the past 2 months have basically been a huge final push towards pushing out this release candidate that kept me extremely busy and had me dreaming of code changes, merge conflicts, and deprecation warnings. So that was intense. I'm not sure if I would say it was fun, but it certainly was intense. And yeah. At this point, I want to give a huge shout out to Jacopo Tediosi here, because not only did he send a ton of PRs with fixes of long-standing bugs that he discovered while basically doing a review of the OctoPrint code base, that had been hiding in plain sight with anyone else actually reporting them. He also helped review all of the deprecation cleanup that I did, which was a lot of back and forth, I think, over the course of a week. in a pull request with 365 additions and 1,533 deletions. So a ton of stuff, really. He also gave me a heads up about stuff that I accidentally removed or broke in the refactoring, which I did not intend to actually remove or break. He also, and that is really interesting for the plugin authors of you out there, wrote a tool for plugin authors to scan their plugins code base for deprecations and removals. Currently, I think this only supports changes in the Python-based backend code, but I think he's also working on getting the front-end related changes pulled into this thing. And so you basically run it against your code base, and it will tell you the problems that you can expect with when upgrading to OctoPrint 2.0 or a later version, where maybe you are still using stuff that has been deprecated already and is slated for removal in 2.1 or 3.0, or has not yet a removal date but is still marked as deprecated. And if you use any kind of that, then chances are high that this little tool will detect that and tell you about it. And I also linked to that tool in the migration guide that I wrote, and also in the blog post that I recently pushed out about the upcoming changes and the removal situation and the plugin situation. Then what else? I think he's also already sent something like 10 or so plugin PRs to plugins, or maybe more. I don't know. Correct me if I'm wrong here. To plugins affected by the removals and that require migration, and implemented the migration stuff. And yeah, so he's already doing what I still have to find the time to actually do, which is in assisting plugin authors in migrating their plugins to be compatible to 2.0. And in the meantime, also basically prepare them for upcoming deprecations. So, yeah. And what I also should mention is the ton of emotional support that I've received from him through these trying times. And overall, he's just been a huge help. And I really look forward to meeting him again in Bologna later this month for PyCon Italy. And at least one cocktail is definitely on me. So, yeah, huge thanks, buddy. Okay, so now I talked about a lot about what I actually did the past 2 months, and what happened with 1.12 and what turned now into 2.0.0 RC1. That is really a mouthful. But what is actually in there? So it is a lot of heavy internal lifting that basically leads to finally making stuff possible, like support for other printer interfaces than serial communication, which is something that I've been meaning to implement for 11 years now, so since 2015, and multiple approaches to do that fizzled out because they were also either too complicated or didn't work with the firmware landscape for one reason or another. So this approach finally worked. We now have a full-fledged plug-in enabled connector interface that allows you to plug and play the bits that actually talk to your printer and translate them to internal OctoPrint APIs, so that now you can not only talk to a serial-based printer, so Marlin or whatever, running Marlin or whatever else firmware, but you can also now already use the work-in-progress Moonraker plugin to talk to hopefully any printer running this Moonraker/Clipper-based stack, which a lot of vendors out of China are currently now flashing on their printers. And together with Jim Neal, the man with the many plugins, I'm also working on a Bamboo connector plugin, which using the local mode implemented in Bamboo Labs offerings allows you to print on their printers and manage files on their printers and such, and control their printers, monitor their printers, etc., purely through the local connection, without any cloud involved, without any vendor spying involved, and without any ways of Bamboo to basically see what you're doing and monetize whatever you are doing there further. With that also came native printer storage support. So the thing is that so far serial printers, already allowed you to do some basic management through the G-code interface, through the serial interface of the files stored on your printer's storage, which usually was an SD card in the past, but these days more and more often is something else. And in order to make that work, that was a bit of a lot of if then else fork situations inside the code, which if you were working with the local files, the stuff in the uploads folder, basically OctoPrint would talk to the file manager inside OctoPrint, which is a full-fledged API layer basically in OctoPrint that does all the heavy lifting of managing files in various ways and their metadata and everything like that, and copying and pasting and whatnot. But in the case of SD card, I always had to take a different route and directly talk to the printer, and that was a bit backward and made everything way more complicated and way more error prone. And that is something that I now cleaned up, and I actually also had to clean up in order to allow printer storages on other kind of printers other than the serial thing to work. So the printer connector will now basically register with the file manager if it supports some kind of printer storage and tell it, hi, I do that, and here are and there is a defined API that allows the file manager then to actually talk to the currently connected printer in order to manage files and mount that as a printer file storage inside. And that now has enabled basically all of the APIs that work for local stuff to automatically also work for printer side stuff, and that also means metadata can now be queried and managed that way as well. And there's also cross storage management. So streaming a file to SD, for example, is no longer streaming a file to SD inside OctoPrint with a specific implementation and all of that, but instead all of this is encapsulated now in basically a copy between the local and the printer storage, and that makes things way more maintainable and way easier to debug, and also way more universal, because the same now works if you want to upload something to your Moonraker based printer. It's also just a copy from the local to the printer storage, and the same with Bamboo. So that streamlines things a lot, and also enables stuff that previously wasn't possible. And while the serial connector does not actually allow downloading files from the printer storage, because that simply was never implemented in serial-based firmware, that is not a hindrance for other printer connectors. And so that is also now possible through this implementation to do stuff like getting the G-code viewer to visualize the file you're currently printing from the printer storage on your Moonraker-enabled printer. So stuff like that also works through that. And should in the future there be some kind of firmware changes still on the serial-based stuff that actually allows me to fetch the files stored on the printer and not just consider this a write-only interface, then the G-code viewer will also automatically work with that as soon as I just flip the necessary flag and implement the file fetch. So that is really nice, and makes everything very, very plug and playable basically, and implementing a new connector also gets simplified by this native storage integration. With that I also did some changes to the storage interface itself in the file manager to allow for native thumbnail support, because the thing is that in order to allow showing thumbnails from printer storage, I needed some API in there to actually support that. And instead of waiting for the existing thumbnail plugin to adapt to that API, I figured, okay, we are simply now going to support native thumbnail support inside OctoPrint itself, as well in the upload manager, and also in the files panel on the left side in the sidebar. And that now works if the storage supports thumbnails. Completely irregardless on whether the storage is the local storage, is the printer storage, is some kind of other storage, which you might implement through a plugin, which might be a cloud storage or a thumbstick or whatever. And for the local side of things, I actually wrote a little standalone Python library / command line tool that does this thumbnail extraction from provided G-code files for various methods of embedding them, and that can easily be updated now separately from OctoPrint. So that might also help the one or other person out there if they want to do something with thumbnails. But yeah, huge kudos to Jim, who maintains the current thumbnail support plugin, because basically the work on this tool lies on his shoulders. I adapted a lot of his existing work. Also spent something like a day or so installing various slicers and trying to figure out how they were doing things other than what was already implemented, and so also was able to implement the one or other additional thing with tests and everything. So that should hopefully now be quite solid and universally usable. Then another thing that I wanted to achieve was fetching the print time estimations from the connector as well, because the printer usually knows best how long it will take to print a certain file. In the case of streamed files from local over serial, I am now evaluating the M73 commands injected by the slicer inside the serial connector and reporting those back. And in the case of the Moonraker connector, the Bamboo connector, I'm actually taking the data reported by the printer itself and pushing that back. So whenever you are printing something now that has M73 commands inserted by a slicer through serial, or you are printing on the Moonraker or the Bamboo connector, you can rest assured that the data that is in there the data that is reported to you by OctoPrint with regards to the print time estimate and the progress and such will now actually be as accurate as what you get right on the printer. That doesn't necessarily mean that it is 100% accurate, because print time estimation is tricky. It is a nonlinear process. It involves a lot of environmental factors and a lot of tuning and all of that. But I think that in the long term it should make a lot of people out there happy. With all of the heavy lifting needed to actually make all of this possible, I also, of course, had to adjust the REST API here and there. So the Connect API to allow you to select the connector and other parameters for connection than the port and the baud rate to connect to, because a port and a baud rate don't make much sense for example, the Moonraker plugin. So there were a lot of changes to the REST APIs and also in the file management and such, but in order to not immediately nuke all third-party plugins that are out there, OctoPrint's API is now versioned. So you as the client calling OctoPrint's REST API can signal that you actually understand the version 2 of this API. All of this is, of course, documented in the REST API documentation on docs.octoprint.org. And if you do so, then you get the new version where you can actually control all of the new functionality and connection parameters and whatnot. But if you don't do it that way, then you simply get the old behavior. And that should hopefully keep everything working for everyone of you who's going to use only the serial connector. Nothing should change, but long term we have the option to actually also see adapted third-party clients that utilize the new functionality, also thumbnails and such. What else? Trusted authentication proxies are now also a thing. So for probably also a decade or so, it's now been possible to configure OctoPrint to trust a remote user header. So if you had a reverse proxy in front of OctoPrint that did your user management for you, you could tell it to send a remote user header to OctoPrint, basically just stating the username with which you wanted to log in after the reverse proxy had already cleared you. And then OctoPrint would see this user header, evaluate it if you had the corresponding flag set, and then log you in, and basically even create the user internally if you told it so, with the groups attached to it if you told it so. And That was kind of nice for certain setups, but it always had the problem that you could only tell OctoPrint to either accept this user header or not being the default. And if you told it to accept this user header, it would always accept it when it got it. So if there was some kind of way to bypass your authentication proxy and simply pipe in this header with the username of your admin user, for example, into OctoPrint, then an attacker doing that would get full access to your OctoPrint instance, which obviously is a problem. So with 2.0, we are now doing it differently. There is no longer a Boolean flag that you can configure that tells OctoPrint to basically put blanket trust on the remote user header, but instead you tell it or give it a list of trusted authentication proxies, which have to be a subset of your trusted reverse proxies, and only if the request comes in via one of these. So one of these is in the proxy chain that OctoPrint sees. Only then it will actually evaluate the header. There is migration logic in there that will migrate the old Boolean flag into some sensible default for the new one, the new configuration approach. But I think long term this will also make it way more safe and secure for certain setups that seem to be more common these days. Then, of course, there's also support for Python 3.14, which was surprisingly unproblematic to implement. The biggest problem, if I remember correctly, were some third-party libraries that broke left and right in certain versions, but certain versions that I still had to use for other Python versions. So the usual overhead of supporting a whole range of Python versions struck here as well. OctoPrint 2 is currently not yet compatible to Python 3.15, or at least maybe it is, but I haven't tested it with that, and so it will refuse to install under this. Python 3.15 also isn't yet released. I think this is planned for something like September or October. I see that once I find the time to actually test this, I will test it, I will adjust what is needed, and then either it will be made compatible to Python 3.15 in the shape of something like 2.0.2 or so, or it will have to wait until 2.1. Python releases are now happening yearly, with often a bit more complicated changes here and there, and also Python deprecations are happening yearly, which is also the reason why I am now having to bog down a bit more on the supported Python versions that OctoPrint is still supported under. The problem is that libraries are dropping Python support faster than you can say Python these days, and the maintenance overhead has increased significantly ever since the release cycle of Python sped up. So that is also one thing to consider here. Apart from that, as I mentioned, there were also tons of bug fixes in the shape of pull requests from Jacopo or in the shape of stuff that I did over the past 1 year or so. During the spring cleaning, I also took care of, I also got rid of a lot of technical and documentation debt that's been accumulating the past decade or so. So lots of to-dos that are outdated were removed, and lots of new to-dos that I had to take care of in the next couple of versions were added where needed, and the documentation I also tried my best to adjust and match the current implementation again in some bits. For example, the JavaScript client was a bit undocumented here and there and things like that. So all of that is, as I said, was released on April 27th. And so far the rollout is looking surprisingly good. I had nightmares about it, so I was pleasantly surprised that nothing crashed and burned so far. So of course there were the expected issues with third-party plugins that now refuse to even get loaded by OctoPrint because they implement stuff that is simply no longer not implement because they depend on stuff, try to import stuff from OctoPrint that is removed because it was deprecated for 10 years. That was expected, and as I said, that is going to be tackled by sending PRs like there is no tomorrow and adopting if needed. But apart from that, it was surprisingly calm so far. So currently, I see around 160 instances running the first RC, and around 860 hours have already been printed, most of them using the serial connector, but I think there were also something like 5 or so Moonraker instances in there, so that is really nice to see as well. Haven't yet seen a single Bamboo one, but time will tell if that changes or not. I already got some bug reports too. Thank you for everyone who sent one in, and I think, apart from one thing that I have not yet been able to reproduce and still need to figure out if that is actually a bug or was just a very, very weird environmental fluke, all of those have already been fixed and are ready for RC2 now. So something that puzzled me a bit looking at the tracking was that with the release of the first release candidate, I saw that something like 50% of the instances were reporting that they were closed with error. Which is a bit weird because usually you have something like a small handful of those, and then the majority is disconnected, so closed, and the 50% of all usually something like that are idle or printing. And so the stats were shifted heavily in that case, and it turns out that this was not actually because so many instances where something was going wrong with them or anything, but my reporting was wrong. It turns out that I renamed a state during my heavy refactoring internally, so something called offline is no longer reported, but now only closed is being reported, and I was simply missing filtering for that in the graph. And once I did that, everything looked fine and more close to what I'm used to. So we are now sitting at 25% being closed and 25% in an error state, which is still a bit much, and something I will try to figure out why. Might require some interviews for RC2. But I will keep an eye on that. Okay, so that was the past 2 months, basically. What are the next steps? Obviously, I plan to push out 2.0.0 RC2, still a mouthful, out as soon as possible with the already created bug fixes. Then I'm also currently looking into the Bamboo connector plugin because, there were some bugs that need to be fixed in there as well, and some implementation problems that we are still facing also have not yet been solved. So that is also a bit of a focus. And then, as I said, also when I'm not busy with RC stuff and such, I also want to do my best in supporting plugin maintainers with migrating their code base to support 2.0. And then there's one other thing that I am thinking that I actually still need to do in 2.0 is I don't know how familiar you are with the current issues with GitHub as a platform. So there have been a lot of stability problems, and the official communication says that it's basically a scaling issue because they are seeing an unprecedented amount of commits, of branches, of GitHub action runs and such. Probably because of all the AI slop, but okay. And whatever the reason for the stability and the availability issues on the platform are, it basically means that a lot of us in the developer space are slowly losing trust in GitHub as a forge to trust our code bases with, where it actually will be highly available. And given that OctoPrint basically relies on GitHub's release mechanism for most of its update notifications, that is a bit of a problem. So if plugin authors now lose trust in GitHub and migrate to other forges, like for example Codeberg, and OctoPrint doesn't yet support tracking releases on Codeberg, then the whole OTA update basically becomes a bit of a mess. So my current idea is to use the time that I still have until the stable release of 2.0 and basically sit down for a day or two and implement version checks against Forge Joe releases, which is what Codeberg and a lot of others self-hosted code forges are running these days. And that should already solve a lot of these problems and allow plugin authors a bit more flexibility. I know that at least one author is currently looking into moving to Codeberg, or actually already has. And I also have seen over the years a bunch of plugin authors that did not go on GitHub, but rather some other kind of forge. And so, yeah, the need is there. And yeah, the idea is definitely to offer here some more choice. So, and as I said, it will probably not be a lot of work. As far as I saw, the APIs are pretty compatible, so it should only be some minor changes to the GitHub release check that will enable a whole bunch of stuff here already. Yeah. And yeah, usually I would say 2.0 is frozen, so no more features to put in there. So that would be something that would have to wait until 2.1. But frankly, we live in way too interesting times to be so inflexible at the moment. So I'll see if it's still possible to do that. Yeah. Okay. I think that was pretty much all that I wanted to talk about today. I know it is a lot of, and then I did a lot of code changes and reviews, and that is it. But sorry, that this has been my past 2 months. I know it's not that exciting, but at least not for you. For me, it was very exciting and outright frustrating and hair-pulling at points. But yeah, it is what it is, I would say. The next one of these will be in June. At least that is the plan. And yeah. All that's left to say, I think, at this point is, as always, thanks for being here. I hope it was interesting despite the slightly dry topic. Of course, stay healthy as always, and happy printing. Bye.